Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing.
Okay, ready?
Welcome
to
Eat, Move, Think,
the show about
Optimal
wellness brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
You're known for being one of the most intense individuals in the gym.
Because I was so enthusiastic about achieving my vision and winning one championship after the next. So when I went into the gym, I put my gym bag down and I immediately attacked the weights. Boom, boom, all the way to the top until you just can't do it. You know, it's like in Germany we say, bench on, tench on. If you do something, then do it. Go all out.
Amazing clip, Jess. Who is that?
Oh, you don't recognize his voice? That's Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, Mr. Universe himself.
Probably the best bodybuilder of all time. We're using this clip because when you think of strength training and weightlifting in particular, isn't that the sort of thing you think of?
Yeah, these buff, enormous men being incredibly aggressive in the gym.
Totally. And wearing tiny Speedos on stage. Very shiny orange skin.
What an image.
But actually, there is new research that suggests that strength training is important for other reasons besides looking buff.
Ooh, tell me more.
A new study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine tracked the lifestyle habits of people who were around 70 years old, and it found that regular physical activity was associated with up to a 32% lower risk of all-cause mortality.
So dying for any reason. So aerobic activity extends life. I think we knew that.
Yeah, I mean, we know exercise is good for you, but the reason why this study is so important is what it found about weightlifting. And adding weightlifting to your aerobic physical activity routine was found to decrease risk of all-cause mortality by up to 47%. And the kicker is that strength training actually reduced mortality more for women than it does for men.
So this must be one of the first studies to establish the longevity benefits of strength training.
You're right. It's not just for Arnie to win competition after competition. It's for all of us to live longer and better lives.
I'm Chris.
I'm Jazz. We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think.
And in today's episode, we have the lead author of that new study that was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. Her name is Dr. Jess Gorzelitz.
She's also a weightlifter herself. She's an associate professor, and she directs the Physical Activity and Cancer Survivorship Lab at the University of Iowa.
She's doing cool things there, and her study has been picked up by huge news outlets like BBC and Time Magazine.
But we'll let her do the talking in her conversation with Dr. Andrew Miners, who is our Move host and Medcan's Clinical and Product Director of Sports Medicine, Therapy, Rehabilitation, and Fitness.
Here's Dr. Miners.
Welcome to the Eat, Move, Think podcast. I'm the Move host, Dr. Andrew Miners. We've got a really exciting talk here today. We're meeting with Dr. Jessica Gorzelitz, who's the Director of Physical Activity and Cancer Survivorship Lab at the University of Iowa. Welcome, Dr. Gorzelitz. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Dr. Miners.
You've had an interesting career so far, being a PhD as well as being a weightlifter yourself, because we're going to be talking about a certain study as well as the benefits of physical activity, particularly weightlifting on humans as we age and get older. So why don't we start off by just giving me a little bit of your background? How did you get interested in weightlifting, exercise science? What got you to where you are here today?
Yeah, my involvement with weightlifting began in the 5th grade. I had aspirations for being a professional athlete, and I'm about 5'6", which prevents that. But, my dad sort of felt responsible, I bet, for like the genetic heritability of that. So he took me to his weightlifting gym to meet the crew. And from that first day, the smell of the iron and the sweat and these guys with these huge thick necks who were just shaking my hand and breaking my fingers, I was just totally hooked. And primarily weightlifting has kind of been my safe place. Like it's where I go to think and move. And I followed my interest from there to the fact where it's now a real privilege to be able to research it and get really cool statistical findings that we can use to improve human health.
Very cool. I like lifting the weights myself too. That's been my mode of exercise more than cardiovascular. I've always said I'm very dangerous over short distances, but I'm not much of an endurance athlete.
I tell people, I'm like, I'm allergic to running, so I need to find something else.
Absolutely. So, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be talking about exercise and aging, but more particularly about weightlifting. Now, you're the lead author of a really interesting paper that was recently published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. So independent and joint associations of weightlifting and aerobic activity with all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality in the prostate, lung, colorectal, ovarian cancer screening trial. Now that's a big mouthful for an article title, but that's
Sure
kind of how it is with white papers and research papers. So this is a really fascinating thing. And before we get into it, why don't you tell me a little bit about what the prostate, lung, colorectal, and ovarian cancer screening trial was, so we can set the stage of how we're going to move forward.
Yeah, 100%. That's really important to start with. The name of the study, so it's the prostate, lung, colon, and ovarian cancer screening trial. And that's abbreviated PLCO. So going forward, it's just easier to abbreviate that way. And this study was actually began in the early 1990s. And the purpose of the study was to examine cancer screening practices. So this was back when they were trying to determine the specificity of certain cancer screening tests. Like, is it good to take a PSA test? This is like almost 30 years ago.
Wow.
And maximizing efficiency, these people were followed, not just for that primary study looking at cancer screening practices, but they were followed for up until 2016. So that's where my study comes in. People were asked about their weightlifting behaviors, and then they were followed up for death. So it's one of the ways that we can look at the associations to see what they told us and then what happened functionally.
Interesting. So you look specifically at their responses in and around weightlifting and exercise as part of this larger trial.
Yeah, so that was my main research question. So there have been a ton of studies published from the PLCO database, and it was really surprising when I joined the National Cancer Institute, there was nothing published on weightlifting. It's in the study questionnaires.
Yeah, but nobody mined that data or mined that information.
No one asked that question, so I called dibs.
Wow. So tell me, who were these people in the study? How many people were they? Who were these people that were studied? And is the study still going on, or it stopped in 2016?
So that was their last known follow-up. So the study is technically open, right? So investigators can Google it right now. There's a lot of biospecimens. People can still use the data. But these individuals were enrolled from across the country in the early 1990s. And the objective was to get a representative nature of the study. There were over 10 cancer centers that recruited for patients. And these were about 150,000 people at baseline.
That's a lot, yeah.
And by the time they got to the weightlifting question, which is where my study began, that was about 100,000 people who were then subsequently followed up. Because people always can opt out, right? They can say, I don't want to participate, or they move, right? Or they pass away before they get to the weightlifting question. So my study had 100,000 people in it.
Which is still a great sample size. Like, that's a lot of people.
It's huge.
Yeah, it's amazing. So these people were older people, younger people? Who were these people in this study?
When they were originally enrolled, they were about 45 to 65, but by the time they answered the weightlifting question, adults were about 71 years old. Okay. So this study, it's very relevant for older adults, which generally is an underrepresented group that we think about. We really focus on adults, usually young adulthood, but this is your 71 plus crowd.
Yeah, especially when it comes to weightlifting.
Yeah.
And that's why this is so important. And we're talking specifically about that and how weightlifting can help you with longevity and living longer, living healthier. I think everybody, if you ask them, hey, is exercise good for you? Everybody would say, well, yes, of course, exercise is good for you. But a lot of times people think of cardiovascular exercise, like strengthening the old heart and lungs, cardiorespiratory exercise. And I see a lot of patients, and I see elderly patients, and you ask them about their exercise or their physical activity behaviors. Not many of them are doing, when we talk about over 65, are doing a lot of weight training or resistance. It's a smaller percentage for sure. And I often say to them, argue with patients that weightlifting becomes more important as you age, not less. Because when you're young, you're already strong, right? To some extent, you can get stronger. But as we age, we get age-related muscular decline, sarcopenia, and we lose strength, and that gives us all kinds of risk for fall risk and other things. But people don't think of weightlifting for the elderly. Why is that?
It's a good question. And to your point, I agree with everything you said, and then for women as well, right? With the estrogen changes with postmenopause. So it's even more important for us women. I still talk to people who have a visceral reaction to weightlifting.
What do you mean by the visceral reaction?
It's very strong, right?
Very strong, yeah, passionate.
They conjure that image of Arnold Schwarzenegger, right?
Big muscles.
Making people do something unsafe.
Right.
And weightlifting is a specific type of muscle strengthening activity. It's very purposeful. And I like to remind people that exercise is fundamentally dangerous. We are deliberately taxing the body to cause it to reap benefits. And that's okay. We are supposed to do that. If we don't tax the body, we decay even faster. So I think it's tough. I think there's a cultural opinion about what older people can or can't do or should not.
Yeah, cultural and even societal based.
Absolutely. The fear of injury, fear of hurting oneself, that's what people, when I say visceral, they're like, oh no, I don't want to hurt myself, right? It's really a shame that we have this response, because when people start a new weightlifting routine in particular, most of the adaptations are neuromuscular.
Especially at the beginning.
Yeah. So it takes several months for us to see like this sort of hypertrophic and hyperplasic benefits.
Hmm.
This is better neuromuscular coordination. This is fall prevention. This is longevity.
And hypertrophy is the growth of the muscle, so making the muscles physically bigger as opposed to just getting better at doing the task, training your neurological system, your motor system to move and be more responsive to loading.
Yes.
So one of my colleagues was at a medical seminar not too long ago, and I can't remember the name of the speaker that she told me, but it was a physician who was specializing in women's health. And her quote that my colleague took away was that women need to lift heavy blank. And, the S word was thrown in there. And I found that fascinating, and I totally agree with that. Weightlifting historically probably wasn't something that was associated with women or females in general. Would that be a fair assessment? And that's changing, obviously, but.
Yeah, 100%. Weightlifting used to be reserved for athletes, right? Athletes were always men, right?
Mhm.
So now we're catching up to it as well. So I do think that connotation runs deep, and we're finally starting to catch up.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Because you looked at both men and women in your study. So let's get back into your paper and the results of your paper, because we talked about the study and the data that you accessed. And your study was looking specifically at mortality, right? Death. So reducing your chance of death.
Correct.
What did you find?
So the title is very long on purpose
Mhm.
because it's a sophisticated analysis that boils down to looking at cardio exercise, aerobic exercise, weightlifting, or them both. And then we looked at 3 separate outcomes in our study. So we talk about all-cause mortality, which is literally death from any cause. So did you die or no?
Right. And would that include just were you alive or not? Like, did you die?
Yep. So we don't know necessarily for sure why the person died, but we do know from death records that they are indeed no longer with us. And then the 2 other outcomes we included were cardiovascular disease, so deaths attributed to cardiovascular disease, so stroke, heart attack, peripheral artery disease, those types of outcomes that we get from the death certificate,
Mhm.
and then cancer mortality, so individuals who passed from a cancer-related death. So basically what we found was that both cardio or aerobic exercise was independently associated with lower death from any cause. Weightlifting independently, so no matter what, if you weightlifted, you had a lower risk of death.
That's not new though, right?
That's not new. That's been done 100,000 times.
But the weightlifting,
That's the unique,
that's new.
to my knowledge, that association's never been published before. So weightlifting alone lowers one's risk of death. But what I think is actually the main finding, and what's really interesting, that it's the weightlifting with aerobic exercise that had the highest risk reduction or like the most efficiency. So again, people are very fixated on cardiovascular health, and I get that it's number 1 killer of Americans.
Mhm.
But I'd argue, if you're going to deadlift something, your heart and your lungs have to get blood to those muscles, right?
For sure they do.
So that is the unique finding. Weightlifting alone was associated with lower death, but weightlifting in combination with aerobic exercise was actually the best outcome.
That's huge, really. I often say, if people are going to work out, what modality would they use? And I always say resistance training. Like if you're doing a circuit training and you're doing movements across multiple joint angles, full body type movements, and you can do some isolated body movements too, but you're getting a flexibility, range of motion.
Yep.
Like mobility, and you're getting a cardiovascular challenge, especially if it quick transitions between exercises, like an interval training type workout. And you're getting the resistance training. You're challenging all the systems that you need to work on: mobility, balance, cardiovascular, and strength.
100%.
So it makes sense to me, but nobody's ever really looked at that, especially just looking at resistance training or weightlifting.
Yeah, so this is an important point. So I'm trained as both a kinesiologist or an exercise scientist, and then as a physical activity epidemiologist,
Okay.
which is literally looking at population level, physical activity and exercise behaviors. We have many different ways to quantify the types of aerobic activity that people do. We have wonderful tools. Most people wear a Fitbit,
Mhm.
right? Or an Apple Watch.
I got one right here.
I have a Fitbit, right? That same level of specificity is nowhere near what we know about muscle strengthening activity.
Mm.
There is a huge gap in how much research is done about aerobic activity and how much is done on muscle strengthening activity. And it's really important for me to talk about this because the federal activity guidelines say that we're all supposed to do both.
Mhm.
We really fixate on that cardio, but
Mhm.
it's at least 2 days per week of muscle strengthening activity. And one of the reasons there is a dearth of, we don't have enough information about weightlifting in particular, is we don't have a lot of studies that ask about it.
Mhm.
I think it's just now coming to the forefront that researchers and clinicians as well are realizing that this is a health behavior.
Mhm.
This isn't some jockey performance type of thing. We're
Right.
not all on steroids, right? It's starting to be understood as a health benefit. And I'm really proud of my paper
Yeah.
because it's a public health piece, right? This isn't, all of those jockey things. I do have a poster of Arnold on my wall, but this is health, right? This is public health.
Totally. And it's huge. Like, this is life-saving information if people start to take this to heart. I grew up an athlete too, and I still play touch football and men's league slow pitch and all this kind of stuff. And, I'm pushing 50, and I play with guys that are older than me, 50s and 60s. And they're saying, oh yeah, I got to stretch or I'm going to get injured. But really, when it comes to prevention of injury and increasing capacity and tissue tolerance, strengthening is really important, especially for muscle tendon issues.
Absolutely.
Like loading, improving the load capacity. So I tell these guys, stretching's good. Don't worry about it. It's not bad for you, but you got to get strength training if you want to keep playing these ballistic sports. So not only will it help them with their weekend warrior activities and staying injury free, it might help them from not dying.
So that's like the point of my article. People are very fixated on the either or, but it's an and.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's definitely an and.
Yeah.
To your point, you don't have to give up what you do, but maybe add some lifting into your routine.
Makes sense. Now, in this study, because the questionnaire from the PLCO study, how much detail did they get into around the behaviors? Like, did they talk about frequency, duration, type of weightlifting, or just weightlifting? In your paper, you mentioned any weightlifting.
Yeah. So one of the limitations with these types of studies is I have the data as they are. I can't go back and modify anything.
Mm-hmm.
So the questionnaire had a lot of very detailed information about aerobic activity, right? Like moderate intensity, how long, frequency, all of those variables. And for weightlifting, the question was simply lift weights. And in the last 30 days, have you? And if you have, how frequently? And that came out to either a weekly or monthly assessment. And those categories are in the paper, but we don't know the duration. We don't know the type of weightlifting within that domain, nor do we have the proficiency of the individual. Like, is this a new routine? Have you been lifting for 30 years?
Sure.
So that is a known limitation with this type of study. However, we do know that they answered as best they could with respect to weightlifting.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. But you also found significant differences between men and women.
So we found effect modification. So I will put my epidemiologist hat on.
Yeah, explain effect modification. Explain that.
Yeah, so it is actually defined as heterogeneity among strata, and nobody really cares what that means. Basically, what we can do is look at an association overall.
Okay.
How does weightlifting look in people? And we saw lower. And then we looked at it separately for men and for women.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found when we separated out by men and women, aka strata, we found that the effect was different. So both men and women had a lower risk of death, but the amount reduced was higher in women. So they actually saw a better benefit from weightlifting as opposed to men. So it's called an effect modifier.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't the case for education or for smoking or for BMI. All of those categories were quite consistent. But it was interesting, when we checked across men and women, we did indeed find it. So we had to report on it.
And so any insights into that? Historically, we think of, as we talked previously, especially in the 70-year-olds, probably weightlifting is not something that, say, health providers or physicians just historically recommended for women in their 70s. Hey, you should start working out. And probably in that age range, there might be fear or just being uncertain, or weightlifting is not for me.
Mm-hmm.
When, in fact, they get more benefit. Everybody gets benefit, but they get more benefit.
Yeah.
Is there any insights around that?
Yeah, I like to speculate on this because this is
Mhm.
the limitation of our data, right? We can't examine any of these things I'm going to talk about. Other people can,
Right.
So I'm happy to offer my insight. The interesting piece for women, it could be body composition, aka lean tissue, right? If you are weightlifting, if you're using the overload principle, they are probably more lean
Mm-hmm.
than women who are not weightlifting, right? And that has been shown to have a beneficial effect. It can be related to bone density too.
Mm-hmm.
We know women who have stronger muscles have stronger bones, and then if they fall, they have a lower risk of death from any cause.
Right. Like hip fractures and things.
100%. So like that's the easy thing to point to. And then it's also, we found this effect modifier for women, but this is an even more public health facing, message, because women live longer than men, right? So it's not just the fact of like the risk of death, but the quality. So women have more years on this earth. They should have better years in terms of functionality. I tell people that I'm not an old person yet, but I want to be a strong old lady who's weightlifting with bones of steel.
Yeah.
I want to be in that demographic.
Super cool.
I'm happy to be in my 30s finally, but Women within 10 years of me, I always hear, I'm afraid to weightlift because I don't want to get bulky. And they reference some CrossFit athletes or physique bodybuilders, and there's a fear of that physique. And it's really tough because these individuals can't understand how much work and sacrifice and diligence goes into that physique. It's not an overnight response that individuals will have. You don't pick up a barbell and then get traps of, Zeus. It takes a lot
Unfortunately.
it depends on where you want the gains, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe grow the delts first,
Yeah.
but it's just so surprising that, weightlifting is a health behavior, but there's so much cultural influence with this. It's just, it's like an uphill battle for the rest of my career, to be honest.
So in that situation, like let's say you're doing a talk to a group of women, say they're middle-aged women or older women, and they don't know anything about weightlifting, and you're trying to convince them to do this. What kind of talk tracks would you use or points would you use to try to convince this person, hey, this is good for you. This is something you should be doing. This is more than walking the dog or walking around the block for exercise. Like, you need to do this.
Yeah. So I actually can pull from my other line of research here. So my primary research interest is actually exercise and cancer survivorship. So helping individuals after a cancer diagnosis. I primarily work with endometrial cancer, or uterine cancer, commonly known as. And I actually don't get a whole lot of resistance, pun. They're interested, but they don't know how to start. That's why it's a privilege to be a professor of health promotion, because part of that behavior change strategy is meeting an individual where they are. What do they currently know? What do they currently do? Almost everybody at an older age has some sort of functional mobility issue, right? A shoulder pain, a bad knee, etc. And then it's teaching them that those things don't prevent you from being active. They're modifications, not preventions.
I find the same thing when I see patients and we're starting a rehabilitation plan.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fear, kinesiophobia, which is fear of movement, fear of exercise. You know this, but for our listeners, I almost treat the mind before the body and communicate on, what to expect. So here's what we're going to do. Here's why we're going to do it. And here's what to expect. And I often spend a lot of time setting the expectations with clients to know that, hey, you're going to be a little sore after, right? This is called delayed onset muscle soreness. It's a normal, anticipated, expected response of starting something new, and that it's not going to kill you.
No, 100%. And it's so interesting to hear you say that, right? Because delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS, in my head, it's like, oh, I had a good workout, right? Like I killed it.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
I'm sore, right? But my studies, these are clinical trials. So we need to instruct patients on what's normal and what's not normal, because we want them to be safe. Before anyone starts on an exercise intervention, we do all of the coaching around the safety of exercise and the symptoms. And for women in particular, I don't let them lift anything until we do the core bracing. Until you can maintain a strong, solid core, diaphragm activation, pelvic floor, and the core, you don't start lifting anything.
Very cool. So weightlifting helps you not die. That's new. It works best. It'll help you not die even better if you mix cardiovascular training and weightlifting.
Correct.
I think your study said that it was a 41% reduction in all-cause mortality.
41 to 47%, depending on how much cardio they did.
That's almost 50%.
Yeah, basically cut it in half, right?
Wow. That's big news and big research. Why else should we be telling people, not only you're not going to die from this, what else is this going to be good for?
Yeah, it's just so interesting because I know from my scientific training, I know most about this question, but it's so, our study simply looked at mortality as an outcome, which is novel. So It's just interesting to pull on my expertise. The bottom line for older people is functional independence and strength. This isn't just being in the gym. This is carrying your groceries up the steps with ease. This is getting on and off the floor to play with your grandkids. This is being able to hold your hands over your head to change a light bulb for 20 minutes.
Totally.
These are the things that help you age in place and help you be a strong, functional, independent older person. So you see the functional independence that comes from the neuromuscular piece. The strength is obviously there, right? Being a stronger person is associated with that. But there is emerging evidence that is exploring the role of muscle and how that's involved in all of our other physiologic systems. So, for example, how exercising your leg muscles can, improve your lipid profile, so your cholesterol, those types of things, how it helps lower your risk of diabetes. Muscle is one of the largest organ groups in the body, and it takes a lot of sugar to move. So it can help with chronic disease prevention, chronic disease maintenance, in addition to all the things we've talked about.
So it can not only make you live longer, it can keep your function so you live happily, right? Maintain your strength, reduce your risk of falls and balance. So resistance training and improving lean muscle mass by resistance training might help you via a frontline management, things like diabetes and other obesity-related illnesses.
100%. It's not just living long, it's living well.
Yeah, very cool. It's a lot of different things that are acting together, but the basics are that resistance training is really healthy for you. And we should all be doing it.
We should. Like the federal activity
Yeah.
guidelines recommend this, and it's at least 2 days per week of all major muscle groups.
Mhm.
One of the things I haven't yet talked about in terms of this sort of weightlifting impact on mortality is the potential social aspect. Aerobic exercise, running, those types of things, you can do at a gym, you can do at a treadmill in your basement, you can do around your neighborhood.
Mhm.
But weightlifting requires that weight and the equipment. And my assumption is that people have to go to a recreational facility to use it. I assume that people don't have platforms in their garage.
Yeah, definitely.
And so for our study, it's quite possible that the effect of weightlifting is due in part to the social nature. People aren't living in isolation. They're going to see their friends. Part of that could be the immune response because being around humans is, full of
Mhm.
germs. It's not just the sort of physiologic benefit. There's that psychosocial benefit as well. To
Mhm.
have a group of peers, people you check in on, people that care about you outside the home.
Just talking to people, and if you're working it with a partner and you're counting or your encouragement, all that kind of stuff could have an impact on positive health.
100%.
Very cool. Well, one thing, I guess, from a practical perspective, how should someone begin a strength improvement program? But really, it's just start small, build gradually, and begin with your core.
I mean, some is better than none and more is better. I think starting the routine really will depend on where people are at with resources because it's really easy to, hire a trainer or get a boutique gym membership. That's a great hands-on approach, but that requires a lot of resources and finances to handle. I have found a lot of really great YouTube channels that are focused on things like simple equipment that people can start with. A banded bicep curl, a gallon of milk, I think is 4.6 pounds, something around that.
Mhm.
It's tough because people who don't do resistance exercise don't intuitively know how to do it, but there are resources to help people get started, whether they're low cost in the home or they are at recreational facilities.
Very cool. And you do some research around that too. Like, how do you engage people of maybe lower socioeconomic status or who don't have access to facilities? You do work in that area, I believe.
I
Right?
do. That's self-serving to add that in there. But
Mhm.
the field that I'm in is called exercise oncology. So helping individuals with cancer be physically active. And a lot of the studies that have been done or are still ongoing are at these large academic medical centers. Having people come to
Mhm.
us, we study them and they go back home.
Right.
And it works when it works for whom it works for.
Mhm.
Most people don't live near these cancer centers. One of
Right.
my main focuses of my research agenda is getting people active where they are. So that includes socioeconomic status, that includes rurality, that includes comfort and confidence in going to a gym.
Mhm.
Previously, I've done work with women with endometrial cancer doing a progressive home-based routine.
Mhm.
First of all, they loved it. It was really safe and they adhered quite well to it. So now that I'm at the University of Iowa, we are expanding that approach to give these distance-delivered interventions.
Mhm.
Home-based approaches lack that social structure.
Mhm.
We have to be creative with engaging people to make sure they're not isolated at home.
Absolutely. We like to call it flex working out when you have the ability to work in person or remotely if people are traveling or whatever. But it's really interesting because you do see that transition in how people engage in exercise. The pandemic impacted that, how people relate to exercise and think about exercise and how people do exercise, which was interesting.
We lose how complex of behavior this is. A lot of us that study exercise are exercisers. Like it's in my Outlook calendar. I'm going to be at the gym at a certain time.
Yeah.
But the complexity of human behavior is real. And,
Mhm.
childcare responsibilities, weather, transportation, it's hard to adopt an all or nothing response. In reality, we're humans and we live in the gray. And that's another takeaway from the study, to be honest. I hear people say like, I have to do cardio and weightlifting and flexibility. Like, my God, that's a lot. But in
Mhm.
reality, the worst group to be in, and we see this time and time again, are those who do nothing.
Mhm.
So adopting the all or nothing response is very toxic.
Right.
And even if you're not doing as much as you think you should, trying to get some activity in is going to be better than anything.
It's amazing advice. That's really key advice. Like doing something is better than nothing, and that the worst thing to do is to do nothing.
Yep, 100%.
That's huge. It's amazing how good exercise is for everything. Really.
Yeah. I mean, like it's the one drug you can take where the side effect is you sleep better and you'll feel better about yourself.
Also a great quote.
Like,
I might steal that quote from you. That's a great quote. Yeah.
there was a paper, I remember reading this in grad school. If exercise came in pill form, everyone would take it daily.
Hmm.
All of the effects are multi-level and multi-system, and yet people still don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. So if someone's going to start an exercise program and there's 3 exercises, what ones would you choose and why?
the guidelines are for the total body, but if you only can pick three, I'll pick one for the upper, one for the lower, and one for the core. So the upper one would be a push-up or an incline push-up. No assumptions about someone's, physicality. So it can be as simple as finding a wall, and with a stable foot position, what you can do is place your hands shoulder width apart, hold your belly in tight, and slowly bend your elbows, lower yourself to the wall, and push away through the base of your hands. So those are the types of exercise that will activate, the front of your chest, the upper back muscles. It's functionally doing a push-up on the floor, but in an elevated position using the wall, then you don't have as strong of an influence on gravity. And as you get stronger, you can move it down to a countertop or a table or a stair to eventually the floor. So that's a really easy one. You don't need any equipment. You just need a wall.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
In our study, we did chair squats. So people hear mixed things about squats, but I always say this: if you can sit on a toilet, you can do a squat. So what I would tell people to do is find a chair that doesn't move, put your feet shoulder width apart. Same thing, pull that belly button into our spine, and maintaining an upright torso position, push through the bottom of your feet and come to a standing position. We do this every day without thinking about it.
Yeah.
But then when you return to the seated position, take a lot of time and focus on what your toes and your heels are doing, taking extra time to push that butt back into your chair and slowly bend the knees and return to a seated position. So it's that taking that time and like letting that tension be in your front of your thigh and back of your thigh muscles allows for strengthening.
Right.
And then the last thing we did in our study is a supported chair sit, or a supported V-sit. So again, in any chair that's a non-rolly device, what I can have the individual do is just put their feet flat on the floor, about shoulder width apart, tighten their butt muscles like they're holding in something, and then sit up nice and tall with the weight on the back of their butt. While pulling that belly button in towards your spine, having a nice stable core, what you can do is slowly lean back and think about your muscles, just your belly muscles, supporting the weight of your torso. And when you feel some tension and you feel like you might fall back, sit there and hold, maybe 30 seconds, focusing on the tension in your belly, but breathing through your chest. It's a nice isotonic exercise. So we're not shortening and lengthening the muscles, but rather we're just holding them under tension for a period of time.
Excellent. Great tip. So lower body, upper body, and some core activation. Very simple and safe to do.
Very simple.
What's your outlook? What's your future look like? What are you working on next? What do you want to work on? Like from a research perspective or from a professional perspective? What's on your horizon moving forward?
Well, I just hit a PR in bench last week, so I want to keep that positive
Nice.
momentum going. But what I'm working on right now, we have that same data from PLCO, and I want to interrogate the data, especially related to these cancer-specific mortality outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Time since diagnosis is highly influential, and I'm really excited to parse out the influence of cancer sites. So for example, breast versus skin versus lung.
Right.
So that's the epi side. In the behavioral space, I'm getting my agenda set up here in Iowa. So I've been here all of 2 months, and I'm working with our cancer center to get going on a home-based study like this that incorporates Fitbits to do both aerobic activity and then the same progressive strength training exercise.
That's amazing. Wow, you're doing a lot of great stuff, and I want to thank you because anything that makes people exercise more is a good thing. And knowing that you can reduce your mortality by almost 50% by doing cardiovascular training and weightlifting is huge. So Dr. Gorzelitz, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for doing your research and the ongoing research that you're doing. It's been really exciting to hear all of the positive benefits about weightlifting, in particular on positive lifespan. So living longer, healthily, with wellness as you move forward. So thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure, and it's a great start to deadlift night. So I can't wait to get to the gym.
Excellent. Lift strong, lift safe.
That was Dr. Andrew Miners, our MOVE host and the clinical and product director of sports medicine, therapy, rehabilitation, and fitness, in conversation with Dr. Jess Gorzelitz, assistant professor and director of the Gorzelitz Physical Activity and Cancer Survivorship Lab at the University of Iowa.
Medcan operates one of the largest personal training facilities in the country. So if you're seeking guidance on how to start a strength training program, contact fitness@medcan.com or by phone at 416-350-5900 extension 3644.
The Medcan website at medcan.com also is a great source of information about our personal training programs.
Follow Dr. Gorzelitz on Twitter at Jess Gorzelitz, that's JessGorzelitz, and follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at MedcanLiveWell.
We'll post episode highlights and links you can visit on our website at eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Jasmine Ratch is managing producer. Social media and strategy support is from Chantal Gertian, Andrea Imax, and Emily Bozick. Executive producer is Christopher Shulgin.
We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with the specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.